introductions. Welcome to our session on water, war, conflict, and law. I'm Dr. Jerry Jones. I'm a professor in mechanical engineering and the Associate Dean in the College of Engineering, Associate Dean for undergraduate programs. We have two Villanova presenters today, Professor Joseph Della Penna, sorry, Joe, from the Villanova School of Law, and Professor Francis Galgano, Chairman of the Department of Geography and the Environment in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. Our guest respondent is Dr. Dennis Warner from Catholic Relief Services. Today's day-long symposium on the global water crisis, conflict, and cooperation is a collaborative effort between the Catholic Relief Services and the colleges and schools across the university. In 2005, Villanova University, together with 4 other Catholic higher education institutions from across the nation, entered into a formal partnership with CRS, the official overseas humanitarian agency of the U.S. Catholic community. The purpose of this partnership is to deepen our institutions' respective and shared mission to reduce human misery and promote justice, peace, and global solidarity through collaborating in global education, research, advocacy, and service. So the format, before I introduce our participants, is that each of the 2 speakers will have 20 minutes to talk. Then the respondent will have 10 minutes to also speak. And then we'll open it up for about 20 minutes of questions from the audience. So we should be over by around quarter to 6, so an hour and 15 minutes. Professor Della Penna is a member of the faculty of Villanova's University School of Law. His scholarly interests focus on water management and on international and comparative law. His books, which he has either authored or co-authored, include Suing Foreign Governments and Their Corporations, Waters and Water Rights, Water Rights in the Eastern United States, National Resources Law Manual, and Abortion, Abortion and the Constitution. His book, Waters and Water Rights, is a standard reference work on water law in the U.S. Professor Della Penna is the rapporteur for the Water Resources Committee of the International Law Association, with the charge to redraft the Helsinki Rules on transboundary water management. He has been an active member for more than 10 years of the Task Committee of the American Society of Civil Engineers for drafting 2 model water codes. He's also represented persons and groups in water litigation and consulted with government and private bodies on drafting water laws and regulations. Welcome, Professor Della Penna. I will also introduce the second speaker, Dr. Francis Galgano, the chair of the Department of Geography and the Environment at Villanova. Dr. Galgano retired from the U.S. Army in 2007 as a lieutenant colonel after 27 years of service, with experience in tank and cavalry units. He served in Germany, Kentucky, Texas, Saudi Arabia, and Kansas, and most recently at the United States Military Academy, where he was an academy professor and the director of the geography program. Dr. Galgano is a physical geographer with expertise in coastal geomorphology, military geography, and environmental geography. He's published 6 books, 3 physical geography study guides, and more than 20 professional articles focused on geographic and military subjects. His current research involves the study of linkages between the environment and regional stability and conflict. He earned a PhD from the University of Maryland. Welcome, Professor Galgano. Dr. Dennis Warner, our respondent, is a senior technical advisor for water supply, sanitation, and water resources development with CRS. He has over 40 years' experience in international development, working on problems of water supply, sanitation, environmental health, and emergency relief assistance. Raised in the Chicago area, he studied history and engineering at the University of Illinois, where he received his BA, BS in science and Master's in Science degrees, and a civil engineering degree from Stanford University, where he also earned his PhD. Dr. Warner has lived in Tanzania, Uganda, Switzerland, and France, and has held positions with the Peace Corps, University of Dar es Salaam, Duke University, World Health Organization, World Bank, USAID, and several engineering consulting firms. Dr. Warner represents CRS on the board of the Millennium Water Alliance and served on its executive committee. In 2000, he served as a representative of Pax Christi International to the United Nations in Geneva. Welcome, Dr. Warner. So we did it. It was 5 minutes. So we'll begin now with Professor Delacampo.
All right, I may have to speak a little quickly because I have a number of points I want to make. And at least at first, they may not seem all that connected to you, but trust me, they are. I'm going to be talking a bit about climate disruption, and a bit about economics, and a bit about law, international law, as well as local approaches to law. Begin with this. This is a well-known photograph. Comes from a webpage called duckboy.com. If you like cowboy jokes, you want to go to duckboy.com. Conversation about water. Now, all too often, at least, especially at the local level, this is what there is a risk of this when you're talking about water in a water-short world. As was said earlier today, there's actually a lot of evidence that there's not a lot of risk of violence between nations over water. There are a lot of disputes, but violence is quite something different. Now, national water law regimes are already undergoing reformation. This is not talking about some highly theoretical idea. And the reason national water law regimes around the planet are being changed because water is, as a resource, is already under stress. And you've heard a lot about that today already. Oops. Let's try that one. Why is it stopped? There, no? Okay, there we go. Now, wait a minute. This is not right. Well, forget about natural. Okay, it's under stress. All right. Missing a slide. All right, forget it. Anyway, it is under stress. And let's pause for a minute. You know why it's under stress. There are growing populations, and even more so, there are growing uses of water on a per capita basis. Demand for water per capita basis is growing at a far faster rate than the world population is growing. And the reason is, we all, and not just in this country, all over the world, people aspire to a more affluent lifestyle. Everything you consume, you are consuming water. You're wearing clothes, you're consuming water. You eat food, you're consuming water. You use a computer, you're consuming water. Because water is used to make these things. And as we have more and more things, we are consuming more and more water. And again, not just here in the United States, where we consume more on a per capita basis than anywhere else in the world. Everywhere in the world, people want to consume more, and in many parts of the world, they are consuming more. And so you have water, existing water law regimes under stress because they were designed and put in place at a time when demand for water was much less. Now, it's also an international resource. And you heard something about this earlier today, and I'm sure you're going to hear more about it from Dr. Galgano in short order. Water moves. It moves constantly through the hydrologic cycle. And from an international law point of view, the most important aspect of water moving is it ignores international boundaries. Indeed, it ignores all human boundaries. That's why you have men swinging shovels at each other. We heard a comment earlier today, water is a resource just like anything else. No, it's not. It's not a resource just like any other resource. And this movement is the key to understanding why it's not just like any other resource. The water I use today is the water you used yesterday, or vice versa. There's an old joke about Reading, Pennsylvania, saying there's a bar there that has over the toilets a sign, flush often, Philadelphia needs the water. Well, it's funny, it also happens to be true. Keep that in mind. We reuse water. So if Reading were to suddenly start selling its water, let's say to China, there'd be less water in Philadelphia. It's not just Reading's water. That's the key point. And that's equally true in talking about international values. There are about 264 river basins in the world, including almost all of the larger rivers. Now, only one of the 10 largest rivers in the world, for example, is entirely within one country. That's the Yangtze River in China. All of the other 10 largest rivers, and a total of 264 rivers in the world, home to at least 40% of the world's population, cross international boundaries. In the United States, most rivers cross state boundaries, and you get similar problems state to state. The result is, the English word rival comes from the Latin word rivalis, which means people who live on opposite sides of a river. And what do you think the rival was about? You see? Now, I'm only going to say a few words about the Jordan Valley. I think you're going to talk about that more. But I know a bit about it. I've been working on water legal problems connected with water in the Jordan Valley for about 30 years. In the Jordan Valley, water resource shared between 5 different national communities. I use that word national community advisedly to avoid the debate about whether Palestine or the Palestinian Authority is or is not a state. But it clearly is a national community. It is a community defined by a people. And you probably can name them yourselves: Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine, and Syria. This is a region of endemic strife. There has been constant violence between originally Jewish settlers, today the state of Israel, and its neighbors and neighboring communities for 85 years. Sometimes low-level violence, sometimes full-scale war, but constant violence for 85 years. And yet during that 85 years, they have also constantly cooperated over water, usually covertly, in secret, sometimes over, and more recently, overtly. And so instead of talking about water as a cause for war, you can also view water as a cause for cooperation, and I don't have time to go into that in great detail. But it's not unique to the Jordan Valley. Think of lots of conflict situations where nations cooperate over water while they're killing each other. And unfortunately, the cooperation over water doesn't spill over to affect other relations. Right now, Israel, Jordan, and Palestine Authority are cooperating on planning, and maybe they will accomplish it or maybe not, what's called the Red Dead Diversion. This is a proposal. The Dead Sea, in case you haven't been paying attention, falls by about a meter. That's a little over 3 feet a year, the water level. In fact, and the reason it's falling is because the water sources, primarily the Jordan River, that used to feed the lake, and that's what it is, a lake, have been consumed primarily by Israel, but also by Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. And so it's falling by about, nowadays the Dead Sea is no longer a single lake. It's now actually 2 separate lakes because it's fallen so far. And they're increasingly shallow. So there's a proposal to take water from the Red Sea and bring it into the Dead Sea. And I won't go into all the complexities of this. I'll be happy to take any questions you have about it during the question and answer period, if you like, because I'm the legal consultant to the World Bank on this project, working on with a team of other people, economists, engineers, hydrologists, environmental scientists, doing a feasibility study should the World Bank help pay for it. But it's just an example of these 3 communities that don't like each other and all too often are intent on killing each other, still cooperating over water. The question is, how do you do that? Well, the answer is, of course, by treaty and by law. Now, there is one approach, before we talk about law, that has proven very popular with business people, with economists, with politicians, and that's the so-called Washington Consensus. Now, the Marxist alternative to the Washington Consensus is dead, even though there are lots of people around that wish it were not. Now, Marxist models in various parts of the world range from the relatively gentle forms of social democracy that you found in some parts of Western Europe and Northern Europe to rigidly totalitarian forms of planned economies that you found in the former communist countries. All forms have gone. Even places like Sweden and Denmark and Norway have elected conservative governments in recent years who are intent on introducing the market model. And that's what the Washington Consensus is all about. Not so dramatic in places like Denmark, Norway, and Sweden as it is in places like Russia and China, where the market model has been brought in. But it's gone everywhere except in North Korea. And North Korea is, if you're paying attention, is an economic basket case. The Chinese model of guided capitalism, which they're now pressing on the world as an alternative to Washington Consensus. Some Chinese are even talking about a Beijing Consensus, but it's hard to have a consensus with one actor. Has lots of problems. I lived in China for 2 years. I go to China at least once a year. They've got lots of problems, and lots of their problems have to do with the fact that they're polluting their environment at an unconscionable rate, including their water. Chinese report to the UN that they are way ahead of on the goals of achieving the Millennium Development Goals. At the same time, they publish reports saying 70% of their water resources that used to be pure and fresh are unfit for human consumption because of pollution. The Washington Consensus was a consensus among Washington-based financial institutions, and they have been pushing, with varying degrees of enthusiasm, market solutions for all problems, not just for water. The three institutions are the U.S. Treasury, the World Bank, technically known as the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the International Monetary Fund. And shouldn't be surprised they agree with each other. They're all controlled by the U.S. Treasury. They're somewhat discredited by the current economic crisis, but notice the word somewhat, only somewhat. They backed off only a little bit. And markets are, indeed. Since I lived in China before the market reforms, I'm quite convinced markets are the best way for allocating and distributing resources, goods, and services when they work. I just don't think they work all the time. And I don't think, I'll pass over this in the interest of time, I don't think, why am I having, okay. I don't think they work for water. All right. What am I doing wrong? That's the question. See if this works. Water is a public good. And I've already told you why. Because it's constantly moving. It's shared by its nature. And that could be a whole 2-hour lecture right there, explaining what is a public good and why water is a public good. By its nature, it's shared. The water I use is the water you use, and vice versa. Secondly, of course, it's vitally important. It's the second most vitally important resource there is for humans and most other living things. You can deprive us of air and we die in minutes. You deprive us of water, we die in days. There is no other resource that vital to your survival. You can go for a long time without food, weeks or months. People have done it. You can't go without air and water. And finally, transaction costs, and that could be another nice long lecture. Given that I have an interest in your water, I mean, sure, a bottle of water, that's mine. But a lake, a river, an aquifer, I have an interest in that lake, and you do too. And if you try to sell your interest, you're also selling my interest. And to get everyone who has an interest to involved in the transactions is prohibitively expensive. So, examples of so-called markets that economists like to point to as proving that markets work. Now, we're talking about raw water. We're not talking about privatization of water utilities here. California Water Bank, hey, only one lawful seller. If you're willing, if in terms of you're a municipality in California wants to buy more water, only one lawful seller, and that's the state. And if you're a farmer willing to sell your water, only one lawful buyer, and that's the state. That's not a market. That's state intervention, especially because the state set the prices without negotiation by state regulation. Imperial Valley Irrigation District, the district rejected the offer to sell water to San Diego. Secretary of the Interior, and this was the Bush administration, mind you, not some socialist Obama decision, right? This was the Bush administration. Secretary of the Interior said, tell you what, you won't sell the water to, they get their water through water facilities managed by the Department of the Interior. You won't sell it to San Diego, we'll cut you off. You won't get the water at all. Give it back to you only if you sell it to San Diego. That's not a market. That's the kind of transaction the Godfather did. The contract you can't refuse. You know, here's the contract, either your signature or your brains. Well, here, you know, here's the contract with San Diego. Either you get paid for losing the water or you don't get paid for losing the water. That's not a market. A lot of economists like to point to the Chilean Water Code, which was enacted in the 1980s, as proof that markets work. Ha! Look at what actually happens. Almost no transactions, and except in one small river valley, and in that valley, the transactions stopped because of popular resistance. Doesn't function. And I'll give you a source to read about it if you're interested. Karl Bauer's book, Siren Song. What you have here is a pattern of regulatory intervention masquerading as a market that produces a transfer of wealth from the poor to the wealthy. Economic incentives are critically important. People should, in principle, pay for water, and that's a way of discouraging them from wastefully using water. But that's not a market. All right, just a word or two about privatizing services. I'm probably not even going to get to the human right for water. Water utilities in many parts of the world were a municipal service until, and still are. There's strong pressure today to privatize them. The World Bank, for example, often in effect, and not so long ago explicitly, conditioned funding for upgrading water facilities on privatizing the system. Top of which you have many, many countries and many municipalities and other governmental units across the world find it difficult or impossible to raise taxes, find it difficult or impossible to raise fees charged for water service, and so privatizing seems like an attractive option. It's produced serious problems. Let the private capital markets provide the capital for upgrading, modernizing the system. Massive public resistance. You heard about some examples of that earlier today, like in Cochabamba, Bolivia. Laws enacted, again, in many parts of the world prevent privatization. And then you have some rather embarrassing examples. Metropolitan City of Atlanta, which provides water to not just to the city, but to most of its suburbs, the late 1990s, sold, and it's not unique, I promise you, sold the system to a private operator at rock bottom prices. Promises were, you know, private business is always more efficient than government, right? So they promised. Service would improve, costs would go down. Guess what? Service got worse, costs went up. So in the end, around 2004 or 5, they had to buy the system back, but somehow the private owner wasn't as charitable as the city of Atlanta. It insisted on paying high price, getting paid a high price to sell the system back. So privatization has some very serious problems. Now that's different from markets for raw water. But it illustrates, again, some of the similar problems. Now, whoops, now what are we doing? Okay. Another alternative, of course, on the international side, when you're talking about between nations, is the Berlin Rules on Water Resources, for which I was the rapporteur. Approved by the International Law Association 2004, summarizes the current state of customary international law, and replaces the Helsinki Rules, which if you work on international water law, you'll inevitably hear about the Helsinki Rules. They've been replaced now. Same organization that did the Helsinki Rules did the Berlin Rules, and it goes way beyond the UN Convention on the Law of Non-Navigational Uses of International Water Courses. And I think I'll skip over the specifics of it. Now what am I doing? There we go. Let me go down here and get right to the, if I can, where's the cursor? Okay. See if I can get right to the idea of a human right for water. Now what's going on?
It's faulty equipment.
Faulty equipment, all right. All right, let's see if we can get, okay. Let's see if we can get this up. Slideshow. I apologize for this, okay.
It just takes time.
Just takes time.
Electrons are slow. It's cold.
All right, well, look, I think I'll just dispense with the PowerPoints altogether. Human right for water has been recognized first by the UN Committee on Human Rights in General Comment number 15, approved in 2002, followed by the General Assembly, and well, I should say the Berlin Rules themselves in 2004 recognized a human right to water. And finally, the United Nations General Assembly in 2010, by a vote of 122 to 0, adopted a resolution recognizing a human right to water. And the core idea, which is, I think, best set out, oddly enough, since I wrote it, I think it's best set out, in the Berlin Rules, recognize certain obligations on the part of states. The basic point, oh, I should point out, by the way, 122 to 0. That means 70 members of the General Assembly did not vote for the resolution. It includes most of the industrialized nations of the world, including the United States, including Britain, Netherlands, Germany, lots of other, Japan, and the very simple reason to explain why the industrialized countries, for the most part, France, I think, voted for it, but most did not, is they're afraid they're going to be asked to pay for it. And right now, especially right now, it's hard to ask countries to pay for something. The core obligations you have up here, to take no step that interferes with a person's access to water. Now that costs a state nothing, except you cannot create a legal monopoly of a river, a lake, an aquifer. I'm almost done. And that itself means severe limits on the ability to privatize water resources. And secondly, of course, take no step to deprive a people or a community of access to water. That second one, primarily, we're talking about military steps. It's very tempting when you're fighting an enemy to try to cut off or destroy their water supply, although in practice it rarely happens. And I mentioned to you the example of Israel and its neighbors. They not only don't cut off each other's water supply, they actively cooperate in ensuring each other's access to water. Nonetheless, it's tempting in war and has been done occasionally. And if you look at the Geneva Conventions on the laws of war, it's flatly prohibited. Secondly, to protect the right to water, To prevent third parties from interfering, again, this comes back to no private or monopolies. Prevent third parties. You have a river on your land, you can't deny someone the right to use the water they need for their personal survival. Even in the Western United States, where you have a system of appropriative rights, which could mean, for example, you deny someone the right to irrigate their farm because someone else has a senior appropriation. Even in the Western states of the United States, you can't deny someone the right of water they need, what we call domestic uses, their personal survival. And to the extent that people do depend upon private or public suppliers of water, to regulate water providers, to ensure fair and equal access to all. No discrimination based on social class, on race, on gender, and so on. If I could move more quickly, I'd put all of this on the screen. And so on, to assure fair and equal access. So this comes back to what, if you were here in the talk Chris Kelby was talking about, has to be, if you're going to have a utility to provide people with water, it either has to be a public utility or it has to be a publicly regulated utility. And finally, of course, and this is the part where many industrialized countries start to worry, to fulfill the right to water, legal recognition and enforcement is the easy part. To resolve equitably disputes over transboundary waters internationally or within a system, within a country, and when we have these disputes, we have a dispute between Georgia and Alabama and Florida right now, for example, over sharing of water. But also to resolve disputes equitably between direct water users. Two farmers want to irrigate, who have a fair and legal system, and there are a number of different ways you can approach that to allocate the water. Provide education to people regarding hygiene. Now it's starting to cost money, right? Provide education to people regarding hygiene and sustainable use. And finally, and this is the key word here, is progressively. To an international lawyer, that means not right away. Okay? Progressively to make water available to persons or groups that are unable, for reasons beyond their control, to realize the right themselves with the means at their disposal. So the obligation is to work towards a goal of everyone having access to water, not immediate implementation. With that, I'll stop. Sure.
Whether you wanted it or not.
It appears to be running somewhat slowly, so.
Maybe you could take my data stick out. You have to tell it to eject first.
I wonder if it was because it was on members.
That might be. Eject. Okay, it'll tell you in a moment that you can take it out. Meanwhile, you can go forward while you're waiting for that. It's taking its
A nice
time.
picture of Villanova, eh?
Oh, boy.
It's not today.
Nope. Now let's go back and make sure it's ejecting. I apologize if this is my fault. Where's that little green
But
arrow?
it didn't write anything, so if you just pull it out.
Well, you think I can?
Yeah, you can.
Say it, you just take it out.
I hate to do that because it sometimes gives me problems after. But there it is.
Let's take this and see what happens.
Oh, thank you.
Well, it does make a little beep noise. It's responding.
Good, I've never caused a problem like this before, so.
There we go.
Okay.
All right, we'll see what happens now. Well, good afternoon, thank you for coming. I'm going to talk about essentially the strategic importance of water. My presentation focuses mainly on the issue of conflict. The Vice President of the World Bank gave this quote here. One of the great things is when you look at history, especially from this sort of perspective, is our lack of sense of history. This notion struck many people, certainly in the late 80s and early 90s in particular. It ignores the fact that people have been certainly in conflict over water for as long as history has been recorded. We'll take a look at an ancient example today and some modern examples. So the intersection or the nexus of conflict, human activity, water extraction is not new, but essentially this man is correct, and the extraction of water, the use of water, and population has gone up. So what will I talk about? I'll talk about this because this is critical to especially how we, and I say we Americans, view water now, certainly our national security apparatus. We'll look at this issue of environmental security, or the linkage between the environment and regional stability. We'll look at water and conflict. We'll look at some case studies from the Middle East. And if we have time, we'll look at water as a weapon, which is a different view of water and conflict. But, of course, as mentioned in the previous presentation, water has been a source of conflict in the United States, especially in the Colorado River Valley. And here is these nice soldiers from the Nevada National Guard moving out on the parade field as they prepare to defend their water against California out in the west. And brings us to the Owens Valley Water War, which was experienced in the sort of early 1900s. Now, the Owens Valley is this area right here. This is Death Valley, and of course Los Angeles right here. It was discovered, it certainly was discovered by Americans in 1833. It's a unique place. It's a high mountain valley. It's a playa. That doesn't make me feel good about this. It's a playa lake, so it's a high mountain valley. It receives lots of runoff from the Sierra Nevada range right here. And there's three important laws that will come into action here. 1850s, the government passes the Swampland Act, which essentially says if the land is flooded, the government can take it and use it. Everybody knows the Homestead Act. You can occupy some land for 3 years, about 640 acres, and it becomes yours for a small filing fee. And then later, the Desert Land Act, which allowed you for a small filing fee to get 640 acres of land, but you didn't have to live on it. And these will get used very nicely by our good friend Frederick Eaton, right here, the mayor of Los Angeles, in 1898. So essentially what Eaton and his pals figure out is Los Angeles is inhibited in its growth by water, being a semi-arid place. So he appoints his good friend William Mulholland to be the director of the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. And they proceed to figure out a way to get the water from the Owens Valley. They want to have a gravity-fed aqueduct that, I don't know if this is the exact route, but that's essentially where they wanted to go, to bring the water from the Owens Valley to Los Angeles, but then they even came up with better ideas. In any event, Eaton, knowing he wanted to do this, began buying up land under the Desert Land Act. And since every time it rains, the desert floor floods there, they declared much of the land swampland. And by 1905, LA, meaning him, controlled most of the land in the Owens Valley. And then he sold it to Los Angeles at a tidy profit, him and his good friend Mulholland. So what they did was they told the folks who remained in the Owens Valley this is domestic use only, and they started building the aqueduct. But at the same time, they began buying up land in the Fernando Valley. And of course, when they diverted it here to the San Fernando Valley, the farmers and ranchers got very upset, and thus started the Owens Valley Water War, where they began blowing up the locks, shooting at the various public workers, and it went on for a year or two and eventually settled down. The state of Arizona at one time declared war on the state of California, more or less. It was mostly for show, but the Parker Dam, which created Lake Havasu here on the Colorado River, really comes out of the Colorado River Compact of 1922, which essentially divided up the water resources in the Colorado. Arizona smartly refused to sign it because they knew they were, lack of a better term, getting the short end of the stick. And so as construction begins in 1935, Governor Benjamin Moore of Arizona calls out the Arizona National Guard. Here they are. These 6 gentlemen, I'm particularly impressed with this guy right here. He's looking steely-eyed killer. But he calls them out to observe the dam, and as soon as they report that they're building on the Arizona bank, he does call out the remainder of the National Guard, again, mostly symbolic. The Secretary of the Interior intercedes, and eventually California gets its water on the California River Aqueduct anyway. So there have been water conflicts in the United States. In fact, the Billy the Kid, Lincoln County Wars, you know, the famous legends that go on there are part of it. But for the security landscape, really for most of our lives, from the end of 1945 till about 1990, this is what the strategic world looks like. It's basically a bipolar partition of the world. We have 2 superpowers. We have the blue guys, NATO. We have the red guys, the Warsaw Pact. We have a bunch of proxy states all over the world. They're in conflict. But more or less, superpower control keeps these things kind of settled because we don't really want them to act up very much. So we manage to maintain control over most of the problems, but there are water problems seething in these areas. So the Berlin Wall falls in 1990, and after that, the Department of Defense and the various, President Clinton, President Bush, begin looking at these problems of asymmetrical security problems. 2008, the Department of Defense publishes its national military strategy. These are supposedly not in any sort of order, but of course global water resources is one of the things that they publish, being one of the leading problems. And I would tell you that this, global water resources, the problem of lack of governance, and this issue of environmental security really go hand in hand. President Obama, in May 2010, this is available online. There's no security required to get it. I advise you to get it and read it. It's very interesting. He publishes what he says is his national security strategy, and remarkably, much of it centers on these items right here, and amongst the environmental factors are watersheds and water, and of course I think this is a wonderful quote, because I think the President and frankly the Department of Defense clearly grasp the problem that we face, although we are kind of involved into actual shooting wars right now. So the problem is these issues that are sort of difficult for us to manage. So the problem of environmental security is really a look at a broad range of security issues that can interact to destabilize a region and cause conflict. Now, my co-author and I here recently published this, and the way we view it is it's basically risk analysis looking at anthropogenic and natural processes that destabilize environments. So we're looking at things like water, energy resources, food security, and how they interoperate. So what's a good example? We mentioned ancient examples. The ancient Akkadian Empire, flourishing at about 2300 to 2200 BC. This area here faces a severe drought. And here's about the limit of the drought line. It moved in this direction. It's probably caused by anticyclonic activity, but essentially dries up the Euphrates and Tigris River valleys in this area. And of course, what we see here is migration. So the northerners moved into the southern area, and the archaeological evidence dug up by Weiss and Bradley from Yale indicate that there's a civil war. Basically, the southerners declare war on the northerners who moved in there, and essentially destroys the entire civilization in the space of 100 years. So a great example of water resource and conflict. Let's talk a moment about some of the driving factors. In other words, what causes these things to happen? So I tried to boil it down to a couple, and clearly this is an issue right here. Globalization, the global economy, the development of economies has caused an acceleration in demand for water. Clearly people have, with the lowering of the friction of distance between the developed and the developing world, people have higher aspirations, population growth, urbanization, the requirement for agricultural and industrial demands are driving up the demands for water. Although water is renewable, we mentioned the example from from Reading to Philadelphia. Per capita demand is going up, and essentially we have non-sustainable practices that are either contaminating fresh water or using it beyond its renewable ability. And this number, to me, is always remarkable. Depends on who you read. I've read it's somewhere between 1 and 2 billion people don't have access to clean drinking water. So really, I mentioned these economic problems before. Since 1950, the world grew by about 3 billion people. Economic output quadrupled. We expect another 3 billion to 9 billion by 2050, and we're expecting a quintupling of economic output. And again, there's this issue right here. What this population figure means is that 90% of this development is in the developing world. So a couple of things here. Water is essential, and it can't be created. The volume of fresh water is finite. It's also not equitably distributed around the world. Water does not lend itself well to international trade. It's difficult to transport. Water is heavy. You need something the size of a super tanker to make any sort of appreciable movement of water, or a pipeline. We've heard about the issue of law. The problem has been for many years. International law has certainly not been robust in the area of quelling conflict over water. And in the issue of the geo-military strategic dilemma, 200 large river systems, 150 shared by at least 2 states, 50 are shared by 3 to 10 states, and here we have some in particular. We'll talk about the Nile, the Zaire River. Again, some of these are particularly important river systems where we have people who are hostile to one another along the borders. Well, here's a metric of looking at water. This is precipitation. It's one way to look at it. So we clearly have a dry belt throughout this part of the world. This also, as you'll see in a moment, happens to be the world with the highest per capita population growth. The problem of population is kind of interesting because it took us about 100 years to get to 2 billion people. It took us here about 30 years to add 1 billion people. And it took us about 15 years to add another billion. So again, the rate at which we're adding 1 billion people is continuing to increase. And again, as we look at, I could show you a population map, but that's really not the problem. The problem here is natural rates of increase. These areas, which are in the dry lands of the world, are at about 3% rate of natural increase. That means the population doubles every 20 years or so. Okay? And they are some of the most taxed places for water. So how do we use water globally? Right now, irrigation about 73%, industry about 21%, public use, again, drinking, cooking, cleaning, and everything else about 6%. The differences between the developed and developing world is really a function of the economy. Agriculture is more efficient and more effective and more industrialized in the developed world. Industry, of course, is larger. These numbers are starting to equalize a little bit, but we use water differently between the developed and developing world as well. So let's take a look at the Middle East then. And Boutros Ghali, the next war in the Middle East will be over water, not politics. I would say it would be over water, not oil. And I think that's true. And the issue about the Middle East is, again, we have a large area with an arid climate, and we have a unique physical geography in the area. Essentially, we have scarce freshwater supplies. I took this climograph from the Negev Desert, so here's every month of the year. There's their average rainfall. It means it rains maybe a couple of centimeters every year in the Negev Desert. Okay? I spent a great deal of time in this area right here where it essentially rains once every 5 years. So again, there's not a lot of water. Whatever you're going to get is going to come from groundwater systems or high mountain valleys, and of course a trickle-down effect from that. So the area here, we have basically a population crescent that looks like that. And again, if we look at our population maps, we mentioned birth rates and rates of natural increase. These are among the highest in the world. So 3 places to look at. There are more places with water problems, but we'll only look at these 3. The Tigris-Euphrates Valley, the West Bank Aquifer and Jordan River Valley, and of course the Nile River Basin. There are plenty of issues between northern and southern Iran. There are problems down in this part, and so there's others, but we'll just look at these. So water and conflict in the Middle East, the Tigris-Euphrates River Basin, of course, the Fertile Crescent. The headwaters are in Turkey. For the most part, the Euphrates flows through Syria and into Iraq, and then further down into Kuwait as they merge at the Shatt al-Arab. Here's the Tigris River. Again, a matter of national sovereignty. The idea that here's the water resource. The Kurds planned the Anatolia project. This has been on and off since about the late 70s. 21 dams to dam up the headwaters. This would use about 40% or block up about 40% of Syria's water, 80% of the Tigris-Euphrates Valley down here, 75% of the people in Iraq live in this area. Certainly during the time of Saddam, he made it clear he would go to war over this. And in fact, in terms of conflict, both Syria and Iraq funded the Kurdish separatists throughout this region, and they've been fighting a very unknown, long insurgency in that part of the world. So it's a great example of international boundaries. In fact, actually, Syria and Iraq went to war, had a battle in the 1970s over Syrians damming up parts of the Euphrates River as well. Here's one of the most contested spaces in the world, I think, for a number of reasons. This is a satellite image draped over digital elevation model of the Golan Heights, the Dead Sea, Jordan River Valley. And this area would be considered strategic terrain. Now, why is it strategic terrain? It's strategic terrain because the Syrians can sit here, and they have all of the routes into the much lower areas of Israel right here. The Israelis, of course, captured it in the 1967 war. They captured it because it defends their state, but more importantly, it controls the water resources. It is the headwaters for all the water resources in this region. And in fact, it is fairly clear and fairly well understood now that the Israelis may have used preemptive warfare in 1967 to secure these water resources because they had every indication that the Syrians intended to cut them off. It's a great debate, a historical debate. But nonetheless, the problem here, as we mentioned, shared by 4 states and certainly a state-like entity. Alone, the Israelis and Jordan use more than 100% of the available water. It means that the entire water table in the region is being lowered. It means that the base level of the Dead Sea is being lowered, which means it's lowering the river level, and eventually will dry up that valley because it will exceed the ability to recharge through the headwaters up here. It has been a matter of hotly contested. The Israelis' unwillingness to turn over free and gratis to the Syrians all of the water resource projects that they put in there essentially ended the negotiations between the Syrians and the Israelis in the late 1990s. The Israelis have put about $2 billion worth of water projects in there, and the Syrians, for a peace agreement, said you have to turn them over to us directly. So it's kind of an interesting story. More compelling here is their invasion, certainly their counterattack in the 1967 war, and they took the Golan Heights and have held them ever since. But more compelling is the West Bank aquifer, from my view. The West Bank here, hotly contested. Ask every American and they'll tell you that this is clearly a religious issue. Ask any physical scientist who's really looked at this. This is an issue of water, okay? So the striped line here is the West Bank aquifer. The yellow dots are Israeli settlements, and the red dots are Palestinian settlements. So if you look carefully at this thing, the pattern is clear. You can see the line of settlements, essentially, that end just about at the edge of the aquifer, where essentially all the wellheads are. Most of the Israeli settlements were adroitly built on top of the wellheads. In fact, if we could add another layer here, they would almost correlate, probably about 80%. Again, here at the edge of the aquifer, you can see the line of Israeli settlements. So the development on the West Bank, yes, it's a homeland issue for the Palestinians, but it is also a water resource issue for the Palestinians and the Israelis. Last but not least of our Middle East examples is the Nile River Basin. 90% of the water here comes from, covers 9 different states. Different states up here are damming the rivers, most notably the Sudan, and Egypt has pretty much threatened to go to war over the loss of the Nile River Valley. Essentially, the same problem in the Tigris-Euphrates. An entire civilization its rhythms and how it operates is linked to the seasonal flooding of these rivers. How much time? About 1 minute. So I'll leave it at that, and I was going to talk a little bit about water as a weapon. Water has, just mentioned, water has been used, for example, to flood civilians. World War II, dams were bombed. And the case I was going to give was up in the Red River Basin during the linebacker bombings in 1972, where effectively we bombed the natural river dikes to flood the rice crop, keep the rice crop underwater for 96 hours and it dies. And it was a campaign designed to use water to destroy agriculture, to starve a population, and force them to the peace table. We have been in the World Court, little known, since about 1973 for a war crimes charge. We just refuse to show up. So it is a kind of an interesting example. And other states have done this as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to our respondent.
Okay, that's not working?
It's not working?
No, the microphone over here is
No,
not
we
working?
need, that's a more powerful microphone.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Fine, wow. These are two great presentations. We used to say after a very interesting, contentious issue arose, that's a 2-beer discussion. I think this is a 3-beer discussion, and I wish we had a lot more time to go over it. I'll try to just point out a couple of major issues here. The first on the issue of whether water is the cause of war. Dr. Della Pena expressed the opinion, which is growing in currency among many researchers now, that water is really not the cause of war because we don't have many good experiences of it. Well, of course, we don't have many illustrations of a national government saying, we're going to war because we want their irrigation water, full stop. But as Dr. Galgano showed, so many of the conflicts that have occurred in antiquity and in times since then and to the current day have water as a major component in it. And indeed, water has so many facets causing conflict here. It's a boundary to imperial expansion. It's a resource to maintain the settlements of countries that want to take over areas. It's the input to industry and power and everything else like that. That to say that water is not a source of war, I think is simply not right. It's not the sole source, but then nothing in life is a sole source. I also would like to express disagreement with the statement that we agree on water internationally rather than have conflicts over water internationally. And some examples were shown. But I think that's not true again. There are many examples of the technical experts, the scientists, the technologists, the engineers, being able to agree on how water is to be used internationally. And I think this was done for years on the Nile Basin. It was done on the Mekong River Valley in Southeast Asia. It's done even today on the Jordan River and the aquifer under the West Bank. The technicians, the scientists, they do agree on what to do. It's the national politicians who refuse to put it into action when it comes to allocation and access and the human rights to this kind of resource. As the example of water that Israel is using, approximately 85% of the water that the Israeli people use comes from the aquifer, which is basically under the West Bank. And the Palestinians there, something flying here, are not allowed to drill without permission. It's almost impossible to get permission. So Palestinian access to
the aquifer under their communities is severely restricted. They can buy it back from the Israeli Water Company at very high rates. On the issue of privatization of water, I think there was some reference to an earlier comment that I made that water is a commodity, and if I said it was a commodity like everything else, that was a misspoke or misstatement. I meant it as water is a commodity. How many of you have drunk water from a bottle that you purchased in the last week? I would say a good number of you have. Water is a commodity. You can't deny it. Now the question is, how do you regulate it? How do you control it? Privatization of water systems and water sources in the developing world has not been successful. I fully agree with that. And it's very unfortunate, the history you see here in the 1990s, 1980s, 1990s, the international organizations led by the World Bank really promoted privatization of major urban water supplies in the third world. And this was true in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa especially. Many capital cities were privatized. Companies came in, they raised rates enormously, improved services to the wealthy people who were getting it and who could pay for it. But there was no social consciousness or responsibility to improve services to the poor people. And they came up against a basic problem. How do you provide water to people who don't want to or cannot pay for it? And so many of these systems have gone back to governmental control because the national or the privatized companies couldn't keep them going. So I am not in favor of privatizing water systems. I agree with the sentiments expressed here. In fact, I think most of the issues that were expressed here, we agree, but there's it's how it's explained that arises some of the differences. The third point I'll bring up is the human right to water. This is something that's been a hot topic in most international circles for many years. The UN has been debating this for decades. And in the last 10 years, it's really come up and has come to some sort of conclusion. In July this year, the UN General Assembly passed, as Dr. Della Pena pointed out, this resolution, I forget the number.
122 to
0.
Mm-hmm.
Is that right?
122 to 0.
Yeah. In stating that water is a human right. It was a magnificent accomplishment. All of my colleagues in the water sector were really happy to hear this. Of course, the U.S. didn't support it because the U.S. for years and years has not supported water as a human right. And as was pointed out, there is this fear in the industrialized countries that if you do that, if you say something is a human right, then somehow you have to follow through on implementing it, and that may cost some money. And in countries that have a private sector, a robust private sector, this will cause conflict with that part of the economic sector. And it's really too bad that over the years, the United States, which really poses itself as the protector of basic fundamental rights, especially when it comes to governance rights, democracy, and issues of that nature, has not taken a substantive, vigorous lead in developing human rights. And so it has been marginally participating in these things over the years, but it hasn't taken a leadership role. And it has often been an obstruction to moving events forward. And so when it finally got to the point in the UN system where it was clear that there wasn't anything the US could do to stop it, it eventually agreed in September with the subsequent vote by the UN Council on Human Rights that water was a human right. So we had the General Assembly Declaration first, which was voted on 122 to 0. Then the Council on Human Rights had a consensus vote, which the US gave approval to. But then a few weeks later, they wrote sort of a petulant statement saying They didn't agree with the process. It didn't give enough negotiation. Their concerns were not listened to. And so, again, it puts the U.S. in a position of agreeing sort of negatively to something that a good part of the world wants. It's too bad we didn't have time to talk about water as a weapon, because indeed, the Geneva Convention of, I think it's 1949, states that if you, as a warring party, destroy public facilities which are necessary for the support and welfare of the population, that is a violation of human rights, and it's a war crime. So it is a war crime to bomb a water plant. And that has been done. That has been done in recent wars. And when you're a big power, you rarely are called to account for it. When you're a small power, you may be called to account for it. Thank you.
So we have some time for questions. Please come to the microphone, or the microphone will come to you.
Is that one on? No,
Other than
this one's
passing
not on.
legislation, what's the UN's role in mitigating some of this water as a kind of conflict? I was particularly thinking about the Middle East. Do they run like desalination plants, or do they have any way of providing, or is there a role for the UN, or is it purely just policy?
No, it's all policy. There is the UNDP and the UNEP. That's Development Program and Environment Program, which do provide some funds. And that's, I think it's UNDP that's very active in the Jordan Valley region. And they do provide some funds. They do not themselves build or operate facilities, and I believe the UNDP is not involved in any desalination programs. They provide funds for schools, for various other relief works, but they have not spent a lot of money. Now, some of the European countries, Norway and Germany in particular, have invested in Palestinian water infrastructure. The Israelis, of course, have a very elaborate, well-developed infrastructure. Some international funding sources, including the World Bank, have invested in Jordanian infrastructure. As I mentioned, I'm involved in a World Bank study whether to fund the Red Dead project. So there is international funding coming in, and sometimes that funding brings with it international experts, engineers and others, to work on the projects. But ultimately the projects remain in the hands of the local people, which is probably where they should be.
Okay, thank you. Question over here.
I'm good. Have you guys ever looked into water conflict as in terms of rainwater? Because I think it was Midwest State once looked into, I forget what chemical they put into the atmosphere to speed up the rain process.
Probably iodine.
The Soviet Union, the old Soviet Union, throughout the 60s and 70s, especially down in the Central Asian area, for growing cotton and other sort of fruits and vegetables that they were needing to feed their population, looked seriously into rain farming. Okay, we tried it mostly to try to precipitation as part of an attempt as a hurricane control measure. Neither of them worked very well. In the end result, certainly from the Soviet attempts to work in the Syr Darya Valley, and that area was, of course, now the destruction of the Sea of Azov and all that. So that has been tried. You can look in sort of history books, ancient civilizations sort of figured out there was this idea between condensation nuclei, in other words, the stuff you get up into the upper atmosphere that water condenses upon, forms clouds and rain. And the Romans tried it, the Carthaginians tried it, and other ancient cultures tried it, was the idea of trying to generate large fires, to put precipitates in the air to attract moisture and cause it to rain and sort of use it to their military advantage, and they just don't work. But they sort of had an idea, you know, like, oh, we'll try this out. There's great examples of that, but it has not worked in practice.
Thank you. Rob?
One question. The United States does not have a national water policy. So by not having a national water policy, does that also affect us when we go into the UN and look at trying to put policies there regarding water?
Well, not necessarily. We do and we don't have a national water policy. That's part of the problem. You talk to some people in the Corps of Engineers and you'd get the impression that everything revolves around the Corps of Engineers. The United States is often very active in international forums. Can you hear me? Not hear me? All right. The United States is often very active in international forums like the United Nations in negotiating regarding water issues, climate change issues. That's, you know, very prominent. So I don't think the lack of a national policy in terms of it hinders us only in the sense that we have to be able to implement it. Now, it may come as a surprise to some people in this room, but if the United States signs a treaty on anything, that is the supreme law of the land and overrides any inconsistent state law. So there actually is no implementation problem. And if someone says there is a states' rights issue that prevents the federal government from doing something internationally, they are talking about a political problem, not a legal problem. Because legally, the United States signs any treaty, it's binding on every branch of government in the United States. So that doesn't legally it doesn't hinder us. Politically, we may hinder ourselves, but that's a different question, I think.
Okay, thank you. We have a question here. Sue?
Dr. Golan, what's your opinion on what the difference you see in areas in the world where there's the large population growth, but the absence of water as a resource? What's your opinion on the reason for that?
Well, you know, I focused on the Middle East. Can everybody hear me okay? So the places that have been through much of the area, okay? Many of the states, especially in the Gulf, have the resources to do things. They have the ability and the resource to drill for really deep aquifers. We're talking 2 and 3 kilometers below the Earth's surface. They just have the funds to do that. They also have the funds to run desalination plants, which are certainly the Saudis do, which are hideously expensive in terms of their operation and their equipment. So the problem is the problem. They have the ability to underwrite water and support an abnormally large population now, based on the amount of water that's would be economically available if they did not have the oil resources. Okay, so that's the mismatch in the Middle East. So you know the idea is if oil were somehow degraded as a fundamental energy resource. I don't know, we go to hydrogen cars or whatever it is in the next 20 years, then they will lack the resource base to fund the water projects that allow the population to grow at the rates that they're growing right now. So the question is, you have a large population with no water, where do they go, what do they do? See, that's the long-term problem for certainly those states in the Gulf. There are other states in the Middle East that are not as blessed with the resources to do that. Okay, their populations are growing and they are struggling to meet their water resource requirements. So.
We have time for one more.
Good evening. I agree with you guys, and I understand why you're against privatization and infrastructures of foreign states. I think it's interesting to look at, you know, the United States usually as a trendsetter for this kind of thing, and look at our current infrastructure. And I guess, you know,
It's been underfunded for about $20 billion for past years. You know, I think we received a C- on our own standards. I was wondering, do you guys support the decentralization of the infrastructure? Because it seems like, you know, if we can't even be holding ourselves to this kind of standard, and you know, if we can't make it work here in the United States, it doesn't make sense that we're going to be able to have either privatized or have these states step up and do it for themselves to create a functional infrastructure, especially in a lot of urban, rural areas where it's, you know, way too expensive to lay pipelines out there. You know, decentralized. Do you guys see this as the growing trend?
Is it decentralized or privatized that you're worried about? I mean, because they're different things.
Well, I'm not talking about privatized at all. Decentralized, in the sense of disconnecting the grid, essentially.
So go out to the communities and develop gravity-driven water networks, if they're appropriate, or dug well networks. I see. Thoughts?
Well, you know, to me,
Microphone.
whatever works. The problem you're alluding to, well, the underfunding of infrastructure is linked to the unwillingness of Americans to pay taxes. It's linked, I mean, our tax rates aren't just lower than they are in any other industrialized country. They're lower than they have historically been in this country for the last century. And yet, what do we have an election about? Cutting taxes. I mean, that's the real problem. And that's a problem at the state level and the municipal level every bit as much as it is at the national level. And so decentralizing is not going to solve that problem. Privatizing, I think, and if I had more time, I could go into much greater detail. I think privatization of much of the infrastructure is a failure. How many are familiar with I-80, which runs across northern Pennsylvania? It runs from the New Jersey border past Scranton and various northern Pennsylvania towns. Governor Rendell tried mightily for 3 or 4 years to privatize it. Do you think northern Pennsylvania would be better served if that were a toll road? It's not just a question of people having to pay to use it. You've got about 43 or 44 exit ramps right now. You'd cut them to 14 because it wouldn't pay to staff exit ramps at more than 14. Is that an improvement on the availability of necessary infrastructure? To use just one example. You could go on and on with proposals to privatize things as a way of solving the problem that Americans don't want to pay taxes. They've forgotten, I think it was Justice Holmes who said, taxes are the price we pay for civilization.
Okay. Sounds like a great way to end this session. Let's thank our participants today.